As many Star Wars fans know, the Jedi practiced 7 forms of lightsaber combat, all of which had their own strengths, weaknesses, and intricacies. The first 6 forms were all widely studied and practiced by hundreds of Jedi, but the last form, Form 7, was much rarer, as the Jedi Order heavily restricted who it could be taught to. That was because both styles of Form 7, the older, more classical Juyo and the more experimental Vapad, risked drawing the user to the dark side. Vapad, the more dangerous of the two, was especially rare, and in all the history of the Star Wars universe, only one Jedi ever truly mastered it: Mace Windu, the style's creator. Windu's mastery of Vapad was a big part of what arguably made him the greatest lightsaber duelist of all time, able to defeat Darth Sidious himself in a one-on-one fight. But what made Vapad so powerful, and why was Mace Windu the only Jedi ever able to master it? In this video, we'll be answering these questions as we take a look at the story of Mace Windu and his misunderstood lightsaber fighting style. Before we begin, let's go over the sources we'll be using for this video. We're mainly going to be drawing on 2 Legends novels today: Star Wars Shatterpoint and The Revenge of the Sith novelization, both written by Matthew Stover. Shatterpoint is where the concept of Vapad and much of Mace Windu's characterization comes from, while The Revenge of the Sith novelization reiterated and expanded on what Shatterpoint introduced about Vapad. We'll be quoting mostly from Revenge of the Sith, since everything Shatterpoint says about Vapad is repeated there. As always, we recommend you buy these books and support their author, and with that out of the way, let's begin.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
Form 7 was the newest and rarest form of lightsaber combat, a difficult, dangerous, and highly unpredictable style that very few could ever master. Also known as the Ferocity form or the Way of the Vornskir, the form was chaotic and extremely aggressive, and it required its practitioners to surrender themselves to the currents of the Force as they were churned up by battle, letting the energy of the fight flow through them and guide their actions. Its blade work bore a vague resemblance to Form 1, involving lots of broad, sweeping strokes, but while Form 1 was rigid and simplistic, Form 7 was chaos, dominated by quick, aggressive strikes and what Jedi Battlemaster Sin Drullig called seemingly unconnected staccato sequences. Its erratic nature made it unpredictable and devastating in combat. The original Form 7 was called Juyo, and it was developed at some point between 5000 and 4000 BBY. This form was rare for most of its history. During the Old Sith Wars, only the greatest of the Jedi Masters knew Juyo, and during the Great Peace of the Republic, the Jedi heavily restricted Juyo instruction, only allowing skilled, experienced students to whom the form posed minimal risk to learn it. Juyo was more popular during the New Sith Wars, but this proved problematic to the Jedi, as many students who learned the form during this period of lax regulation were drawn to the dark side by it. This was also because Form 7 required its practitioners to open themselves up to the rush of battle, to the Force in its wildest and most dangerous state. In battle, combatants poured all sorts of wild and unpredictable emotions into the Force and altered the shape of the Force in the moment, causing it to change to reflect the frenzy of battle. While Jedi ordinarily shut this chaos out, Juyo practitioners channeled it. This made it highly dangerous to those susceptible to the lure of the dark side, who could get caught up in the rush of battle and be drawn down a dark path by it. For millennia, Juyo was the most advanced lightsaber fighting technique practiced by the Jedi. During the final decades of the Republic, however, it was supplanted by a new, more advanced Form 7 variant, which was known as Vapad. This new technique was even rarer than Juyo itself, with just 4 known practitioners and only 1 master, and it was even more dangerous than the more mainstream Form 7 style. It was developed by and for one of the Jedi Order's most legendary lightsaber duelists, the Jedi Master Mace Windu, and to understand Vapad, we first need to take a closer look at Windu's character. Mace Windu was among history's most legendary Jedi Masters, a champion of democracy and justice, a guiding light for the Jedi Order during the most perilous chapter of its history. Windu served as the Master of the Order, the leader of the Jedi Council, which made him second only to Jedi Grandmaster Yoda in the Order's hierarchy. He gave up this title at the start of the Clone Wars so he could devote himself more fully to the war effort, but he still remained Yoda's right-hand man, one of the most competent and trustworthy Jedi leaders. He and Yoda made an excellent team, in large part because of how different they were. While Yoda was a kindly mentor with a pronounced sense of humor, a true gremlin at heart, Mace Windu was focused, serious, cautious, and straightforward. He wasn't unfriendly, but he could be stoic, blunt, and humorless, and he was eternally mission-focused. Windu was a man with the weight of the galaxy on his shoulders, something he was keenly aware of, and in the face of this pressure, he acted decisively and with conviction, trusting the will of the Force to guide his actions. In many ways, Mace Windu was the human embodiment of the Jedi Guardian philosophy, one of the 3 main philosophical tendencies within the Jedi Order. Jedi Guardians were more decisive and combat-oriented than other Jedi, focusing on combat uses of the Force and on lightsaber combat. They were fighters that specialized in using Force to bring an end to injustice, and they actively sought out and battled evil wherever it could be found. The Guardians' philosophy preached that the Jedi were called to be proactive in protecting the innocent and bringing balance to the Force, and Guardians' hearts burned with the desire to make things right however they could. Mace Windu was a Jedi Guardian, and he embraced their philosophy, becoming legendary for his intolerance of injustice and his willingness to put his life at risk to help others. Windu was also renowned as one of the most powerful Jedi of his time. His connection to the Force was strong, and he had an easy time surrendering himself to its will, becoming an instrument of the light side. When this happened, Windu became a one-man army capable of incredible feats, such as destroying a whole army of battle droids with his bare hands. Windu was also one of the greatest lightsaber duelists of all time, and in his day, he was rivaled only by Yoda and Dooku. He was well versed in every form of lightsaber combat, and he was a Form 7 specialist, as we'll get into in a bit. But perhaps his most significant ability was an innate skill he had, which allowed him to sense shatter points through the Force. To quote an entry from Windu's journal, from Star Wars Shatterpoint, imagine a Karoska gem, a mineral whose interlocking crystalline structures make it harder than Durasteel. You can strike one with a 5-kilo hammer and do no more than dent the hammer's face. Yet the same crystalline structure that gives the Karuska strength also gives it shatter points, spots where a precise application of carefully measured force, no more than a gentle tap, will break it into pieces. But to find these shatter points, to use them to shape the Karuska gem into beauty and utility, requires years of study, an intimate understanding of crystal structure, and rigorous practice to train the hand in the perfect combination of strength and precision to produce the desired cut. Unless you have a talent like mine, I can see shatter points. The sense isn't sight, but see is the closest word BASIC has for it. It's a perception, a feel of how what I look upon fits into the Force, and how the Force binds it to itself and to everything else. I was 6 or 7 standard years old, well into my training in the Jedi Temple, before I realized that other students, full-grown Jedi Knights, even wise masters, could sense such connections only with difficulty and only with concentration and practice. The Force shows me strengths and weaknesses, hidden flaws and unexpected uses. It shows me vectors of stress that squeeze or stretch, torque or shear. It shows me how patterns of these vectors intersect to form the matrix of reality. Put simply, when I look at you through the Force, I can see where you break. This ability gave Windu incredible capabilities, and it was part of what made him one of the Order's wisest masters and best tacticians. It gave him a natural gift for strategy, deep insight into everything from objects to people to galactic systems, and it gave him instinctual insight into the effects every action of his could take. This was what allowed Windu to be so decisive, to trust so readily in the Force, and thus give himself over to its will. To quote again from Shatterpoint, "I looked at Jango Fett on the sand of the Geonosian arena, a perfect combination of weapons, skills, and the will to use them, an interlocking crystal of killer. The Force hinted a Shatterpoint, and I left a headless corpse on the sand, the deadliest man in the galaxy, now just dead." Sometimes, people can mistake Mace Windu's grim attitude, strong conviction, and decisive action for darkness. Some claim that he leaned toward the dark side, or even that he blended the light and dark sides to some degree, as symbolized by his purple lightsaber. This is untrue. His saber was purple because it contained a rare hurricane crystal he had been gifted, which had no symbolic meaning to the Jedi, and beyond that, Mace Windu was firmly committed to the light side. In fact, Windu's commitment to the light was much stronger than it was for most Jedi. Mace Windu firmly believed in the ideals of the Jedi Order, in trusting the will of the Force, and in compassion and self-sacrifice, never experiencing even the brief moments of doubt that most Jedi felt at some point. Windu was a strong adherent of the light side. He even believed that most people aligned with the light at heart, and that they would choose it if given a true choice. While he tempered his hope with realism, Mace Windu was an idealist at heart, one firmly committed to the light side and fiercely opposed to the dark. This is important to understand because this was the reason why Windu was the only Jedi that could ever master Vapad. Vapad built on Juyo, the older Form 7 style, and took the classic version of the form to a more ferocious conclusion. Like Juyo, Vapad was characterized by its surrender to the currents of battle, its chaotic and extremely unpredictable nature, and its focus on maintaining an aggressive and relentless barrage of fast slashes. But Vapad took everything Juyo was and turned it up to 11. It was even more chaotic, more aggressive, and much faster. The attacks of a Vapad user, while seemingly random and unconnected, flowed seamlessly between one another, making the user's blade appear to be a pulsing sphere of energy, or even multiple lightsabers striking from different angles. These attacks were precise despite their rapid and chaotic nature, and they were designed to quickly overpower an opponent. As stated in the Revenge of the Sith novelization, this devastating offense was where this style's name came from. Vapad, the 7th form of lightsaber combat, takes its name from a notoriously dangerous predator native to the moons of Sarapin. A Vapad attacks its prey with whipping strikes of its blindingly fast tentacles. Most have at least 7. It's not uncommon for them to have as many as 12. The largest ever killed had 23. With a Vapad, one never knew how many tentacles it had until it was dead. They moved too fast to count, almost too fast to see. So did Mace's blade. The blade work of Vapad was devastating, but it wasn't the maneuvers themselves that gave the style its power or its danger. Vapad was more than a fighting style. It was a state of mind and a way of drawing on the Force in combat. Like Juyo, Vapad required its practitioners to surrender themselves to the Force in battle, to let the chaos and frenzy of the fight fuel them, something that could come dangerously close to drawing on dark emotions for power. But Vapad went a step further. It explicitly involved drawing on those dark emotions. To quote the Revenge of the Sith novelization again, Vapad is as aggressive and powerful as its namesake, but its power comes at great risk. Immersion in Vapad opens the gates that restrain one's inner darkness. To use Vapad, a Jedi must allow himself to enjoy the fight. He must give himself over to the thrill of battle, the rush of winning. Vapad is a path that leads through the penumbra of the dark side. Now, to be clear, there's a difference between the penumbra of the dark side described here and the dark side itself. Contrary to popular belief, Vapad didn't actually involve the use of the dark side in any way, but it did involve the user opening themselves up to the kinds of emotions that fueled the dark side, which was why the Jedi considered it dangerous. As we've discussed before, Jedi weren't forbidden from feeling emotions of any sort. The Jedi acknowledged that all emotions were natural and valid, and they were simply forbidden from letting those emotions control them and cloud their judgment. Simply feeling emotions like fear, anger, or even hate wasn't automatically a dark side thing. Everyone feels those sorts of things, and Jedi were simply called to meditate through them so as to maintain clear judgment. And drawing on emotions, even dark emotions, for power in the Force wasn't necessarily using the dark side either. Jedi could draw on emotions like compassion to strengthen their affinity to the light, for example. The danger of those darker emotions was that drawing on them encouraged the user to go a step forward, to draw on them not just for strength in the Force, but for strength over the Force, to bend the Force to one's own will instead of being subservient to the will of the Force. That was what the dark side was, and why the Jedi were cautious of those darker emotions. Because it was difficult to use something like fear or anger to fuel one's command of the Force, while still also maintaining the restraint, inner calm, and selflessness necessary to make use of the light side. But Vapad was a technique for doing exactly that. Its users cut into the penumbra of the dark side by using dark emotions to fuel their command of the Force, drawing on things like a lust for victory, the thrill of battle, or righteous anger, and channeling them into use of the light side of the Force. Vapad users use these emotions for power while also still giving themselves over to the will of the Force, resisting the temptation to embrace the darkness and assert control over the Force. Instead of shutting out their inner darkness in the heat of combat, Vapad users took that darkness and converted it into fuel for the light. During Mace Windu's duel with Darth Sidious, the Revenge of the Sith novelization describes what this process looks like through the Force from the perspective of Anakin Skywalker. Mace pressed back the darkness with a relentless, straight-ahead march. His own blade, that distinctive amethyst blade that had been the final sight of so many evil beings across the galaxy, made a haze of its own, an oblate sphere of purple fire within which there seemed to be dozens of swords slashing in all directions at once. The shadow he fought, that blur of speed, could that be Palpatine? Their blades flared and flashed, crashing together with bursts of fire, weaving nets of killing energy in exchanges so fast that Anakin couldn't truly see them, but he could feel them in the Force. The Force itself roiled and burst and crashed around them, boiling with power and light speed ricochets of lethal intent. And it was darkening. Anakin could feel how the Force fed upon the Shadow's murderous exultation. He could feel fury spray into the Force as though some poisonous abscesses had crested in both their hearts. There was no Jedi restraint here. Mace Windu was cutting loose. Once you understand Vapad, it's easy to see why the Jedi thought it was so dangerous. It required its users to walk a very fine line between drawing on the darkness for power and surrendering to the dark side, and only Jedi that were very strongly aligned with the light side could do that safely. For those Jedi, Vapad had great potential. It was not only a very effective fighting style, but it could also be somewhat therapeutic, giving Jedi a safe outlet for the darkness that they, like all beings, had inside them. In fact, that was the reason Mace Windu set out to create it in the first place, to find a way to turn his inner darkness into a tool of the light. But because of the danger of Vapad, very few Jedi were ever allowed to learn it. As we mentioned earlier, there were only ever 4 known Vapad practitioners: Mace Windu, Sora Bulk, Depa Billaba, and Quinlan Vos. Vos had only been trained in a few elements of Vapad by Sora Bulk and didn't know the full technique, so really only Windu, Bulk, and Billaba ever used Vapad in full. Sora Bulk, another of the Jedi Order's most skilled duelists, had co-developed Vapad alongside Mace Windu, while Depa Billaba, Windu's former Padawan, had been instructed in Vapad by Master Windu himself. But neither Sora Bulk nor Depa Billaba ever truly mastered Vapad. Instead, Vapad mastered them. The pressures of the Clone Wars intensified the temptations of Vapad use, drawing both Jedi to the dark side. Sora Bulk fell first, as Count Dooku was easily able to goad him into taking the step from Vapad to the dark side. Throughout the Clone Wars, he served as the leader of Dooku's dark acolytes, twisting the Vapad style into a dark side technique. Depa Billaba, meanwhile, fell to the dark side several months after the Battle of Geonosis during a mission to Harun Kal, where the horrors of war, the influence of Kar Vastor, and the use of Vapad broke her. Billaba massacred civilians on Harun Kal before ultimately being defeated and apprehended by her former master. After his fall, Sora Bulk liked to claim that he had become Vapad's only true master, and that use of the dark side completed the form, elevating it to its full potential. But Bulk, of course, was wrong. His dark side fueled Vapad was only an imitation of the true technique, and one that lacked its greatest power. There was only one true master of Vapad, and it wasn't Sora Bulk, it was Mace Windu. Windu alone was able to resist the temptations of Vapad and use it in its truest form, and this was because of his aforementioned strong affinity for the light side. While Mace Windu had inner darkness that he channeled into Vapad, he wasn't drawn toward the dark side, and this allowed him to use Vapad safely and as it was intended, as a tool of the light. Mace Windu's mastery of Vapad was demonstrated by a technique that neither of Vapad's fallen students would have been capable of, one that allowed Windu to turn the power of the dark side back on itself. In its highest form, Vapad allowed the user to not only channel their own darkness as fuel for the light, but to channel the darkness of their opponents as well. This made Vapad incredibly effective in battles against a user of the dark side, because it rendered all the Darksider's power moot. All the anger and hatred that they poured into the battle, all their uses of the Darkside's terrible power would be turned back on them by Vapad. To quote the Revenge of the Sith novelization, Mace was deep in it now, submerged in Vapad, swallowed by it. He no longer truly existed as an independent being. Vapad is a channel for darkness, and that darkness flowed both ways. He accepted the furious speed of the Sith Lord, drew the shadow's rage and power into his inmost center, and let it fountain out again. He reflected the fury upon its source as a lightsaber redirects a blaster bolt. Of course, this technique posed additional danger because it required the Vapad user to open themselves up to the darkness of their enemy. This darkness could be corrupting, but the true Vapad master, one so strongly attuned to the light side that the temptation of the dark side was minimal, could simply allow the enemy's darkness to just pass through them, redirecting it rather than accepting it. Only Mace Windu had the strength of will to pull this off. Only Mace Windu had the conviction, the trust in the Force, and the faith in the light side to do this safely. As the Revenge of the Sith novelization describes, the horrors of the Clone Wars only steeled Windu further to this danger, allowing him to embrace Vapad's full potential without doubt or danger. To quote, "There was a time when Mace Windu had feared the power of the dark. There was a time when he had feared the darkness in himself, but the Clone Wars had given him a gift of understanding. On a world called Harun Kal, he had faced his darkness and had learned that the power of his darkness is not to be feared. He had learned that it is fear that gives the darkness power. He wasn't afraid. The darkness had no power over him, but neither did he have power over it. Vapad made him an open channel, half of a superconducting loop completed by the shadow. They became a standing wave of battle that expanded into every cubic centimeter of the Chancellor's office. This wasn't just an abstract technique either. Vapad's superconducting loop fed all manifestations of the dark side back toward their source, sometimes literally turning the opponent's powers back on them. Mace Windu demonstrated this during his duel with Darth Sidious, in which he used Vapad in response to Sidious's Force Lightning. While all Jedi could, with some effort, use their lightsabers to block Force Lightning, Windu's Vapad actually allowed him to redirect the Dark Lord's lightning back toward its source, ultimately beating Sidious at his own game. To quote the Revenge of the Sith novelization, "Lightning blasted the clouds above, and lightning blasted from Palpatine's hands, and Mace didn't have time to comprehend what Palpatine was talking about. He had time only to slip back into Vapad and angle his blade to catch the forking arcs of pure dazzling hatred that clawed toward him. Because Vapad is more than a fighting style. It's a state of mind, a channel for darkness. Power passed into him and out again without touching him. And the circuit completed itself. The lightning reflected back to its source. Palpatine staggered, snarling, but the blistering energy that poured from his hands only intensified. He fed the power with his pain. While a true master of Form 3 became an unyielding wall and a true master of Form 4 became an unstoppable blur, a true master of Vapad became a mirror. For all the form's aggression, its greatest strength was how it reflected the aggression and power of the enemy. It didn't defeat the dark side, it baited the dark side into defeating itself. As the enemy became more powerful and aggressive, Vapad responded in kind until the enemy was overwhelmed and beaten. It was a precise but overwhelming application of force upon a critical point, applied to a single enemy until they fell. In a sense, Vapad is similar to Windu's other skill, his ability to sense and make use of shadow points. Just as Windu's gift allowed him to find and strike the breaking points of systems, objects, and people, Vapad allowed him to invert an opponent's power onto their own weakness, precisely but powerfully applying force until they broke. It's possible that Windu's ability helped him understand Vapad on such a deep level, and even if not, Windu's attunement to shadow points did give him the certainty, conviction, and resolve he needed to use Vapad safely. The style only really worked because of who Mace Windu was. In turn, Windu's mastery of Vapad, and in particular the superconducting loop element of it, was a big part of what made him the only Jedi that was ever able to defeat Darth Sidious in combat. While even Yoda couldn't beat Sidious head-on, and while even Anakin Skywalker, the Chosen One himself, waited until he had the element of surprise before killing Sidious while he was off guard, Windu took Sidious in a straight fight, and he won. He disarmed the Dark Lord, had him completely at his mercy, and would have killed him afterward had Anakin Skywalker not intervened. Vapad allowed Windu to redirect Sidious's unfathomable power back on himself, using his own command of the dark side against him in a clear demonstration of the supremacy of the light. But in all fairness, Vapad wasn't the only thing that allowed Windu to win this battle. After all, even for a Jedi Guardian, being a Jedi wasn't just about lightsaber techniques, it was about the Force. And Mace Windu was strong in the Force, a fierce defender of the light side, and it was all his gifts, in conjunction with Vapad, that allowed him to win the day. To quote the Revenge of the Sith novelization, "There was no scrap of carpet nor shred of chair that might not at any second disintegrate in flares of red or purple. Lampstands became brief shields, sliced into segments that whirled through the air. Couches became terrain to be climbed for advantage or overleapt in retreat. But there was still only the cycle of power, the endless loop. No wound taken on either side, not even the possibility of fatigue. Impasse, which might have gone on forever if Vapad were Mace's only gift. The fighting was effortless for him now. He let his whole body handle it without the intervention of his mind. While his blades spun and crackled, while his feet slid and his weight shifted and his shoulders turned in precise curves of their own direction, his mind slid along the circuit of dark power, tracing it back to its limitless source, feeling for its shatterpoint. Vapad wasn't just the key to Windu's victory. Rather, what allowed Mace Windu and him alone to master Vapad was also what allowed him to defeat Darth Sidious. It was his devotion to the light, his decisiveness and his conviction, the traits of a true Jedi Guardian. He had mastered himself, defeated his darkness, overcome his fear. And just as Vapad allowed Mace Windu to use the darkness of his enemies against them, he bested the greatest of all Sith Lords by exploiting the root of his connection to the dark side, the fear that even the greatest of the Sith had in their heart, as described in the Revenge of the Sith novelization. Mace could feel the end of this battle approaching, and so could the blur of Sith he faced. In the Force, the shadow had become a pulsar of fear. Easily, almost effortlessly, he turned the shadow's fear into a weapon. He angled the battle to bring them both out onto the window ledge, out in the wind, out with the lightning, out on a rain-slicked ledge above half a kilometer drop. Out where the shadow's fear made it hesitate, out where the shadow's fear turned some of its force-powered speed into a force-powered grip on the slippery permacrete. Out where Mace could flick his blade in one precise arc and slash the shadow's lightsaber in half. One piece flipped back in through the cut-open window. The other tumbled from opening fingers, bounced on the ledge, and fell through the rain toward the distant alleys below. In the end, the Dark Lord hesitated, and Mace Windu, with his endless conviction, did not. He stared into the blackest depths of the dark side and didn't even blink. In that fight, he embodied some of the greatest strengths of the light side, through Vapad, tactics, and sheer strength of will, while Darth Sidious, the avatar of the dark side, was ultimately defeated by the very root of his own power, subdued by the manifestation of his own fury. Windu himself observed as much. To quote Revenge of the Sith once again, "Now the shadow was only Palpatine, old and shrunken, thinning hair bleached white by time and care, face lined with exhaustion. For all your power, you are no Jedi. All you are, my lord," Mace said evenly, staring past his blade, "is under arrest." "Do you see, Anakin? Do you?" Palpatine's voice once again had the broken cadence of a frightened old man's. "Didn't I warn you of the Jedi and their treason? Save your twisted words, my lord. There are no politicians here. The Sith will never regain control of the Republic. It's over. You've lost." Mace leveled his blade. "You lost for the same reason the Sith always lose. Defeated by your own fear." Of course, that encounter didn't end the way Windu had in mind. At the last minute, he made a crucial error, placing too much trust in an unstable Jedi who, by this point, was already well on his way to the dark side. He failed to see the danger Anakin Skywalker posed until it was too late, and this allowed Darth Sidious to live and ultimately triumph. But in that moment, Mace Windu, Jedi Master and Champion of the Light, had triumphed over the dark side, exposing its weaknesses and leaving its greatest student defeated. Darth Sidious was scarred by this defeat, suffering deformities he would endure for the rest of his life. A reminder, perhaps, that the Sith were always doomed to lose when faced with a true Jedi, as Sidious eventually did again to his doom. So, that was our look at Vapad and its only true master, Mace Windu. Far from being a man torn between light and darkness, as he's sometimes made out to be, Windu was a true paragon of the light, and that was what gave him such power. But what do you think? Would you like to see more videos about Mace Windu and Star Wars Shatterpoint in the future? Let us know all your thoughts in the comment section below, and as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.